The Secure in Mind podcast series is an educational initiative of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, or CIAN. CIAN is an international not-for-profit trust network of experts in technology, policy, ethics, and good practice. Our mission is to strengthen society's safety, resilience, and ability to fight against cybercrime and similar threats. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of CIAN's Secure in Mind podcast series. This is a series of talks and meetings and presentations with interesting people in and around the information security, trust and safety, resilience, and related spaces. Today, we've got a great guest. I'm joined by Bjørn Ihler in Norway. He is director of the Khalifa Ihler Institute and founder and CEO of Norwegian company Revontulet. I hope I pronounced that right. I was just told that Norwegians and German speakers are the only ones who get these correct, so I'm hoping I did that justice. We're going to be talking a little bit today about terrorism, violent extremist content, and related activities, how to identify these, how to track these, how to counter these. And I'm going to let Bjørn talk a little bit about both Revontulet, which is a commercial startup active in this space, as well as the Khalifa Ihler Institute, which is a not-for-profit organization that hopefully CIAN will be able to do some partnerships with. We met recently at TVEC, or the cybersecurity forum in Lille in France, where Bjørn was a member of several panels on exactly this topic. And I believe, he's one of the better connected people I've seen online in terms of dealing with this growing and pretty significant phenomenon that's a major threat to online stability, democracy, freedom, and all the good stuff that CIAN exists to support in the digital world. So Bjørn, over to you. You want to talk a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and what your two organizations do?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, John. It's kind of a long story short situation of where we're at, but the Khalifa Ihler Institute, which is the nonprofit, kind of predates the for-profit. And it started very much as kind of an activist-driven, civil society-oriented organization focusing on building resilience at the community level. And so the objective of the organization is building safe and peaceful communities that can thrive, essentially, whether those are online or offline. And in that, there's a lot of focus on indigenous people's rights, women's rights, building democratic infrastructure within both conflict areas and areas that we are kind of considering to be at peace and stable. And through the latter, we started building a lot of our work on violent extremism and started mapping out violent extremist networks and actors, in particular in Europe and North America. A lot of focus at the time was on the threat of ISIS and thinking of terrorism as a foreign issue. And we were thinking that we probably should start closer to home. If we are to tell the rest of the world how to deal with their issues, we need to grapple with our own issues first. And so that was kind of part of the drivers of our approach there. And so through that, we started also working more with the tech sector, working with some of the large social media companies on how to govern extremist content on their platforms. And then in parallel with that, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism started as an organization, and I was chosen to lead the inaugural independent advisory committee to that. And then by 2022, I had run my course on that, stepped down from the leadership position and remained an advisor, but then also started working with the January 6th Select Committee on documenting the storming of the Congress and the relationship between online behavior, in particular between the Proud Boys and the attack on Congress. And then as kind of part of that and my relationship at that point with the tech sector, figured we could start a commercial outfit as well to run in parallel with the nonprofit, and the two of them kind of support each other in kind of a two-body situation. And so the goal of that became to support the private sector in grappling with the issues of violent extremism and terrorism, and kind of through two primary focus area, one being the abuse of services by terrorists and violent extremist groups. So whether that is terrorists using social media or digital tools to recruit, to spread propaganda, coordinate, fundraise, etc., or and the other area being the operational security threats posed by terrorists and violent extremists to things like infrastructure, shipping lanes, etc. And so we're looking at both the threat image and the online behavioral side of things, and like looking at the two as interconnected and using them for analysis of the threat landscape, kind of feeding back and forth between those realms to also help undermine the capabilities of terrorist organizations to operate by removing the infrastructure layer in partnership with some of our clients on the tech side, but then also feeding back into the nonprofit in order to build that societal resilience against radicalization and violent extremism in local communities that are experiencing fragility in different ways. So that's kind of the universe as it stands right now. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. So I think the first big question you laughed when I asked you this before is, what is terrorism?
The reason I laugh is that there's no universal definition, right? And so I think like part of this has been part of kind of my life challenge for the last decade at least. Working on the definitions and taxonomies of what constitutes violent extremism, what constitutes terrorism, etc. Part of that is I studied for my master's in peace and conflict studies in Turkey, and at the time I was also chairing a working group at the UN on youth peace and security and the violent extremism and counterterrorism side of the youth peace and security agenda, and we were supposed to start a policy document by like saying like what we are working on, and then I figured out that the UN alone had like 300 different definitions of terrorism and violent extremism at the time. By now it's way more, and every member nation as well had several definitions, and so it's a really complex question which carries a lot of different baggage. But also being sat in Turkey, I kind of realized that hey, some less than democratic governments are really into abusing the concept of terrorism and violent extremism.
That was going to be my next question, but go on.
Yeah. So we're seeing governments that are less than democratic in various states of authoritarianism abuse terrorism legislation in order to repress opposition, whether that is indigenous communities or national groups that are seeking independence, whether through violent or non-violent means. We're seeing also terrorist legislation being used to silence political opposition from minority parties, etc., within political structures. And so part of what I wanted to do when in classic XKCD style, deciding that the best way of dealing with the fact that there's too many definitions, come up with a new definition.
I'll link to the relevant XKCD in the comments, like everything else.
Yeah. So like there's so many challenges to these things. And what we came up with was that basically we defined violent extremism as the violent denial of diversity. So one thing that like ISIS has in common with like the KKK is their focus on wanting to enforce some sort of monoculturalism within their communities. And so like ISIS wants everyone to follow one particular interpretation of Islam, KKK wants everyone to be white, like whatever it is, like extremist groups always want to enforce conformity to whatever they deem to be the thing that is acceptable within their countries. And so
So
denial of diversity.
hence slang terms related to American domestic right-wing extremists, like, the Al-Qaeda came to mind, vanilla ISIS.
Exactly. And so there's like many different extremist groups and terrorist groups. They kind of all want to enforce some form of conformity within their regions, and then they want to also expand those regions, right? And so that became kind of one of the pillars. But then there's so many questions within that, right? Like, how do you define violence? Is a classic challenge within peace and conflict studies, at least, where frequently we break it down into direct violence, which is when you blow something up, which is kind of what we think of as classic terrorism. But then there's also structural violence, which is where you change legislation, where you build kind of the legal structures to enforce this conformity. And then there's cultural violence, where you find things like racial slurs, general street level racism, etc. That isn't necessarily sanctioned by the state, but also is part of culture at kind of the grassroots level. And so that is essentially like how we are thinking about this, but at the same time also underlining that it is important in order to create communities without the violent denial of diversity to keep in mind the principles that we've established in order to have societies that are functional with diversity. So whether that is things like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right, which is very much developed to ensure a respect for human dignity, irrespective of kind of where people are from, what they believe in, etc. And some of this leans on also the UN Convention on Genocide, as one of the kind of earlier UN conventions that really focuses on the safety of minorities, and kind of came out pretty immediately after the Holocaust in order to try to prevent atrocities like that happening again, right?
I want to get back to that. I thank you, and I think you've really shown the difficulty in pinning terms like that down. What was the famous phrase, like, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter? I want to get back to especially the cultural violence and structural violence aspects. When we talk about topics like stochastic terrorism and freedom of expression. First, in terms, I think, of objectives and groups, that's a really good breakdown. Is that opposition to diversity? When I was a child, the majority of quote unquote terrorist groups, I think pretty obviously terrorist, were on the one hand broadly national objective oriented. Your ETA, your IRA, groups like that, all very ideological. On the other hand, I'd say more political oriented in terms of you're very left wing. Your RAF in Germany, right? Your Brigate Rosse in Italy, guys like that. That morphed. I think where groups like your PLO, your PFLP, George Habash, guys like that came in, started to eventually bridge into Islamism, which even though some of the classic Palestinian terrorist groups were more kind of left-wing affiliated, right? But we saw the kind of the migration of objectives move into kind of Islamist terrorism, from Al-Qaeda in the late 90s to ISIS, ISIL, Daesh in the 2010s. And now we've been, over the last, I'd say maybe 10, 15 years, much more of a focus on especially in places like Europe and North America, right-wing domestic extremism, violent extremism, but also, cultural extremism. Talk to me a little bit about what kind of, especially, and again, with respect to you made a really good point I also want to touch on anyway. It's governments like China. You mentioned Turkey, There's often kind of what is really terrorist and what are simply groups that are opposing our more authoritarian, structures. So I want to focus primarily on what I like to broadly classify as Western liberal free market democracies. Again,
Yeah.
mostly, but not only Europe and North America. What do you see as some of kind of the current major trends in terms of who these guys are, what the objectives are, who are the major actors, just kind of broadly laid out? You mentioned January 6th in the US, obviously.
Yeah, which is
You've
controversial at this point, right?
You've got some experience
yeah,
firsthand with right-wing extremism. What are some of these current kind of trends, and who are the people behind it? What do they hope to accomplish?
yeah. So what you're referring to in part there is in 2011 I was on Utøya Island in Norway where Anders Breivik committed a mass atrocity. He killed 69 people there after having blown up a bomb in central Oslo, literally right in the building next door to where I am right now, and killed 8 people here. Like he was largely labeled as kind of a lone wolf, as was the kind of term du jour at the time, and still very much is in use. And part of the challenge with Breivik and all of the ones that have kind of followed that playbook, if you like, is that they are seen as domestic terrorists in countries where there isn't really domestic terrorism legislation. And so that was a challenge here in Norway, where like there wasn't active domestic terrorism legislation at the time. There was legislation that was due to be activated by Parliament kind of the year after, and did. And similarly in the US, there's a lot of contestation over like the term domestic terrorism in the first place and how we understand it. And part of that is that in order to be prosecuted as a terrorist, one of the things that has to happen in a lot of these countries is documentation of the fact that you belong to a terroristic association that is international in nature. And so what has happened is that countries like Norway, the US, etc., has found it fairly easy to take brown guys and say, like, your grandmother was from Egypt, and so you are a member of a like foreign terrorist network, because like you proclaim that you support ISIS and you have some heritage from abroad. And so we've seen that like terrorist perpetrators on the Islamic extremist side has fairly easily been prosecuted as such, while at the same time we've seen that white supremacists like Anders Breivik, etc., have been prosecuted for things like mass murder, but not for terrorism. And there's like little distinction in terms of like how that plays out for them in their personal lives, being basically imprisoned for the rest of eternity, hopefully. But there's also kind of a problem there in terms of equality before the law, etc. And so part of what we set out to do when starting documentation efforts, and like through the Khalifa Ihler Institute, we started something called the Global Hate Map back in the day, was to establish the international relationships of white supremacist, kind of far-right terrorist actors. And so if you look more closely at Breivik and see who inspired him, that was largely a bunch of European thinkers, some American ideologists, etc. And you can find that in Breivik's manifesto. You can also find it in his traveling and meeting with people, in particular in Eastern Europe. And so my question really quickly became like, what is to say that this isn't a international terrorist network while, say, Al-Qaeda is? And
let me stop you on that one, because I'm looking over the side here. The reason I'm not making eye contact here is because I lived in Barcelona, about 20 meters down the road from the 2017 La Rambla attack, and I first thought it was a flash mob, right? Until I ran out and we like this. Yeah. Anyway, it's pretty horrible. But the suspects in that, well, the guys that were, killed as the perpetrators, right? Even though
Yeah.
at least a bunch of them were born in Morocco, but at least one of them, I mean, they lived in Spain for since they were little babies,
Yeah.
and with you mentioned, the quote unquote lone wolf thing that we've seen with both right wing but also Islamist terrorists is when
Yeah.
you say international organizations, right?
Yeah.
You showed me one of your hate map, which clearly outlines connections, whether it's on social media, whether it's on relationships, having gone to certain conferences, but there's not like one of the things that, for example, IS and Al Qaeda were notorious for, and you see this with, I think, some of the right wing groups as well, is that some of these relationships are very informal, right? So
Yeah.
you're not getting like your classic, Marxist guerrilla cell networks with a formal organizational structure, but there's like
Exactly.
much more nebulous relationships, much more fluid. How does an authority define an international network, and how do you reconcile that with the need for very, very clear legal definitions when tracking and pursuing these guys?
So first of all, it really varies between country and country, right? But also, like as you're saying, like yeah, some of the perpetrators in Barcelona were born and raised in Spain. Most of the perpetrators, if not all, had lived in Spain for like many years before. Same with things like the Brussels attack, the Paris attacks, etc. Like the perpetrators were born.
Breivik,
Yeah, yeah, but like the perpetrators, even though they were kind of seen very much as part of ISIS or like Islamic inspired extremism, terrorism, they were born and raised in Brussels, in Paris, etc. And like yeah, their grandparents, parents, etc. For some of them had like Egyptian heritage, etc. But like at the end of the day, these were by most measures domestic terrorists, right? Um, except for the fact that ISIS claimed responsibility for their attacks, and also that they proclaimed that they were inspired by ISIS in some way, shape, or form, right? Or doing it on behalf of ISIS, etc. And so, like that informal declaration of relationship has been enough to like think of these attacks as foreign terrorism. While
Does that in that case constitute? That's really interesting. Does that constitutes if there is a recognition by the perpetrators and whatever quote unquote global network there is, regardless of what their objectives, does that constitute a okay, because they said so, they're part of this global network?
to some extent, and so that's basically what's been argued in court. For a lot of these perpetrators, there's no trial because they are dead by the end of the terrorist attack, right? And so, like, there's challenges there as well. But at the same time, you have terrorist perpetrators now who are proclaiming that they are doing this inspired by, say, Terrorgram, which is a network that exists on Telegram primarily. And Terrorgram is also saying that like these perpetrators belong to like what we're calling the pantheon of saints, which is kind of white supremacist far-right terrorists that they are looking up to and kind of hailing as heroes. And so they're saying like, if you do these things, you will become a member of the Patreon of like the pantheon of saints. And so, like, what is the distinction between that and ISIS claiming responsibility for an attack? Like, they're the main difference being that like ISIS has a centralized command structure with like a leader, etc., while like Terrorgram is much more decentralized and nebulous, as you say, network. But like at the end of the day, like that doesn't really matter so much, neither to the perpetrators of these attacks nor to the survivors and victims of the attacks, and like that's a key focus, right? Like, and to survivors and victims, bereaved, etc. It really matters what terrorist attacks is spoken about, like what is prosecuted, etc. Like what is the actual crime here, and so that's where some of the challenges of like these nebulous networks really start mattering beyond just like you get sentenced to prison for life. Yeah. And so dealing with the nebulous networks has been really challenging. because within the framework of how the world deals with terrorism, we have these designations and lists. So like ISIS is a designated terrorist organization when a designated terrorist organization says that they've committed an attack and the perpetrators say like we belong to that group, then that's fairly clear cut. But a bunch of like the terrorist designation list, first of all, is ancient. Like it gets updated every now and then. There's a really weak system. Like that's the UN designated list. Every country also has their own designation lists. So there's challenges in how groups are designated. There's a lot of politics that goes into that.
So I was about to say, it's going to get really messy when you have, how do we say this diplomatically? When you have governments that are, on the one hand, involved in cooperative efforts against fighting and investigating and reacting to global terrorism. On the other hand, there are factions in that government or their supporters that are sailing mightily hard on at the limits of what you and I and any reasonable person would consider a terrorist group.
Yeah.
When they
so there's the challenges of designation, there's the challenges of the politics of designation. So like you have over designation in some countries, like Turkey, as mentioned, will use designation lists in order to repress opposition. You also have countries that do not recognize kind of far right extremism and terrorism. Meanwhile, you have like countries that do, and so Canada, New Zealand, and a few others have designated Telegram, and also groups like the Proud Boys on their lists. The European Union has designated the Base, which is a really central network that I think I showed you a network graph of, etc.
Yep.
And so there's some designations of these groups, but at the same time, it's also like really hard to think about the groups as cohesive groups because like most terrorists don't really like carry a membership card of like the group, right?
You like to think if you grew up, with watching G.I. Joe like I did, that there is a Cobra or there is a Spectre or whatever that is doing this, but they don't wear cool uniforms and yeah, it's a good.
Hey, if the world was like James Bond, it would be.
Yeah, well,
a lot more fun to be me.
Not necessarily want all the good guys to be like James Bond. It gets really interesting, I think, when you have organizations or demographics that may have a legitimate gripe, right? I'm not going to mention it because somebody doesn't crucify me, but at the same time, they do bad things. They blow things up, which goes straight back into your point, which I think is a really good observation of somebody who has never suffered from a terrorist attack, despite having seen, one close by, is more likely to focus on the legalities and the quote unquote objective abstract things, as opposed to a survivor that's going to be like, come on, this is right. This is a lot closer to home.
Yeah. No, so there's that question. There's like, and so that's why we kind of have the nonprofit arm that is working on things like democratic institutions, because like in order to take down terrorist networks, you also need to offer the alternative for the organizations that have legitimate gripes to like present those arguments, like, and that's where due process, that's where parliamentarianism, that's where like the institutions we have to maintain kind of civic discourse are central.
And that's sorry if I can quickly, that's a really, I'm grateful that you mentioned that. That's one thing that I find extremely concerning with the increasing polarization, whether it's due to social media or commercial media taking the if it bleeds it leads approach to reporting news. I live in Spain, right? And Spain is a stable, safe country, but we see an increasing radicalization of young people on social media, primarily due to right-wing meme culture. But generally, politics has become, whether it's due to corruption, whether it's due to media, whatever factors, much more partisan, much more tribal, which is the U.S. is the poster child for what happens when people begin to lose faith in the ability of the political mechanisms to act fairly and absorb gripes and deal with them fairly. Yeah, that's a great observation.
So there's that side of things, but then like part of the challenge back to the designations list is also like, how do you govern the spaces where we're having conversations now? Like social media deals with terrorism because like terrorist organizations are using social media platforms to spread propaganda. They're using them to recruit. They're using them to coordinate. They're using them to fundraise, etc. And the traditional model of dealing with that has been through like organizations like our friends over at Tech Against Terrorism, who organized the panels a little bit that we were at. And their model has been very much to lean on the designations list and say, like, this content, because it is associated with these designated terrorist organizations, is not allowed on the platforms, which is a really kind of clear-cut and simple way of dealing with some of this. But at the same time, the question then becomes, like, how do you deal with all of the horrible shit that isn't done by a designated terrorist organization, but still is terroristic in nature? And that's where, like, our model at the Revontulet side is to look at the nebulous networks and understand how are these individuals connected to each other? How are they connected to offline criminal activity? And so we are taking a much more granular approach to looking at, like, all of these networks, and also understanding kind of who are the central nodes in the networks that are recruiting other people into the networks, and how do we deal with those. And that then kind of feeds back into where we are dealing with this from the perspective of denial of diversity, and where we fundamentally believe that in order to have a pluralist society, we need to have spaces where discourse among people with disparate opinions, experiences, identities, etc., are possible. That has been social media for a lot of people, but also a lot of people are experiencing that because they do have a different identity, etc., on social media, are being targeted, are being harassed, are being threatened with rape, or being threatened with death and violence, right? And that is de facto limiting the freedom of expression for some of the groups that need it the most. Mm-hmm. And so we are working with social media companies in order to really enhance the space for discourse for the people who are who needs it the most, and trying to help take down the ones who are not playing by the rules of civilized discourse, basically. And this is where we sometimes get pushback on, like, is this restriction of freedom of expression? And my argument is no, this is enhancement of freedom of expression by creating spaces that are safer for people to express their opinions in. So yeah,
it is a huge topic, and we've only got about 5 minutes left. And actually, if you're
I'm good to hang.
I would love to continue this in a second episode of this, because I have a whole a section of notes here about talking about things like freedom of speech, stochastic terrorism, what the role of platforms is versus companies, what the governments, right?
Yeah.
Where does freedom of expression end? What can I say and what can I restrict on a commercial platform? So I think this is something, if you're up for it, that very much merits a follow-up conversation.
Yeah.
So let's actually schedule that. What I wanted to go in, what I wanted to grab onto quickly is before we wrap up. You mentioned, if you give me a quick overview of, we are focused, Cyan as well as I think Khalifa Ihler focused more on the online discourse, on the online connections. You mentioned offline criminal activity.
Yeah.
We talk a little bit about that. What are the links here? Is there outright organized crime that is involved in this? What are these? We had the classic cases of for example, in Colombia, FARC funding a lot of their efforts, or Shining Path in Peru via narco traffic, right?
Yeah.
What are some of these linkages to your quote unquote offline, physical, real world activity from some of these groups or actors?
So the reason we are documenting the relationship to offline crime in the first place, in particular when it comes to online, like helping platforms regulate the online discourse, and we're doing this through Revontulet primarily, and kind of through our data as a service model and consulting kind of structures. Like, the reason we're focused on that element is that, like, criminality is a really good kind of leverage point for dealing with individuals and organizations on the platforms. So like whether you have like a dangerous individuals and organizations team or something like that on the internal side of client companies, like that becomes then a point where we can say like this individual is dangerous. They are participating in organized crime or in offline crime in different ways. And then that becomes kind of a way in which to take action against them, whether that is through criminal law enforcement action, where we work with partners like FBI, Europol, etc., or whether that is moderation efforts. And so
it's also I think it bears saying it's not just for-profit crime, but also I would imagine it involves things like arms trafficking and other activities that are geared towards physical terrorism.
So what we're seeing is like a lot of crime is for financial gain, and like that includes arms trafficking, which helps fund extremist and terrorist networks, right? And sometimes that's as innocuous as running an online bookshop that sells like Nazi manifestos. Like we're seeing things like that. We've seen people use things like Facebook Marketplace to like sell human skin wallets, or like then using that to like fund their neo-Nazi club.
Well, that's probably like, the most horrible thing I've heard all day. Thank you.
Every step there was illegal. So there's like the relationship between offline and online is fluid and ever present in terms of criminality as well. But like, yeah, we're seeing the criminal activity is often related to fundraising efforts, but it's also then through kind of fraud, scams, etc. But then we're also seeing like physical violence. So whether it is active clubs that are fight clubs, go out and attack kids on the streets, or even kind of into the hooligan and football community, which also has overlaps with like biker communities and kind of organized crime networks in particular in Southeastern Europe, that then also funnels into Northern Europe, where we see strong relationships between things like the Nordic resistance movement in the Nordics and weird organizations and networks in the Balkans. Like these are all things that we are looking at, both to understand the criminal side and help on the criminal prosecution of that, but also to help our clients understand who are actually manifesting a threat offline as well.
All right. We need to wrap up. We're unfortunately coming up on time. We'll do another iteration of this. Thank you very much, Bjørn. It's been a pleasure having you, and I will talk to you in the next one.
Yeah, this has been fun.
Thanks very much. Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.